Trump hosts Netanyahu and Zelenskyy in a single extraordinary day at the White House. Washington, D.C., July 28, 2026. In one of the most consequential single days of his second term, President Donald Trump welcomed both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to the White House on Tuesday, holding separate closed-door meetings with each leader hours before all three men gathered at Washington National Cathedral for the funeral of Senator Lindsey Graham. The overlapping visits, the first time Trump has met face-to-face with both wartime leaders on the same day since taking office, underscored how deeply the machinery of American foreign policy is now entangled in two grinding conflicts: the 5-month-old war between Israel, the United States and Iran, and the more than 4-year-old Russian invasion of Ukraine. Increasingly, officials and analysts say, those two wars are no longer separate stories. They are beginning to bleed into each other. A day built around a funeral. The choreography of the day was itself notable. Both meetings were scheduled around the funeral service for Graham, the South Carolina Republican, who died suddenly on July 11 at age 71 of what preliminary findings described as a likely aortic tear. Graham, who chaired the Senate Budget Committee and sat on the Judiciary, Appropriations and Environment and Public Works panels, had spent more than 4 decades in public life and was widely regarded as one of the Senate's most forceful advocates for an assertive American role abroad, a hawk on Ukraine, a hawk on Iran, and a fierce defender of Israel. His death came just days after he had secured something he had pursued for months: President Trump's public backing for a long-stalled bipartisan sanctions package targeting Russia over its war in Ukraine. Graham had just returned from a trip to a NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, where he celebrated his birthday, and a visit to Kiev when he died. The Senate scheduled a first procedural vote on that sanctions bill for Tuesday evening, timed, lawmakers said, as a tribute to Graham's final legislative push. The funeral itself drew an unusual cross-section of Washington and the world: Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and, seated among the mourners, both Netanyahu and Zelenskyy, the leaders of two nations fighting separate wars that Graham had spent his final months championing. Fox News host Sean Hannity, delivering one of the eulogies, remarked that Graham would have been moved that both leaders made the long journey to attend. Trump used part of his own eulogy to recall publicly reciting Graham's cell phone number on the campaign trail years earlier, something he said, with a laugh, he shouldn't have done before reciting the digits once more from the pulpit, drawing laughter in the cathedral. He also credited Graham's hawkishness on Ukraine, saying Graham had urged him toward a deal with Iran, but never wavered in pushing for continued support for Kiev. It was against this backdrop of mourning and remembrance that two of the most consequential bilateral relationships of Trump's presidency played out within the same 24 hours. The Netanyahu meeting, Iran, Gaza, and a fraying friendship. Netanyahu arrived at the White House just before 11 a.m., entering through a side entrance to the West Wing with little of the pageantry that has sometimes accompanied his visits. It was his 7th visit to the White House during Trump's second term, more meetings than any other foreign leader has had with the president, and his first face-to-face sit-down with Trump since the two countries launched their joint war against Iran on February 28. Along with Vice President Vance, the Israeli delegation photographs released afterward showed Secretary of State Rubio, Defense Secretary Hegseth, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in the room. Netanyahu's own delegation included Israel's ambassador to Washington, Yehiel Leiter, his chief of staff, Edo Norden, and his military secretary. The meeting came at a politically delicate moment for both leaders. Public support in Israel for the war Netanyahu championed against Iran has slipped in recent months, and backing in the United States for Israel's continuing military campaign in Gaza has fallen sharply as well. Netanyahu, who leads the most right-wing governing coalition in Israel's history, faces elections in October. Notably, just hours before the meeting, Trump appeared to vent some frustration with Netanyahu in an interview, though the substance of that irritation was not detailed publicly. Analysts who track the relationship say the two men, who have repeatedly described their alliance in warm terms, with Netanyahu once calling Trump the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House, have nonetheless shown real strain behind the scenes in recent months. None of that strain was visible in the leaders' public statements afterward. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt described the sit-down as positive and productive. Netanyahu, posting to Instagram, called it one of the best meetings he has ever had with Trump, saying the two men share an understanding of their common goal, ensuring that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. A senior Israeli official who was in the room told reporters the two leaders held what was described as an excellent and comprehensive discussion centered first and foremost on Iran, and that they reaffirmed what the official called their ironclad commitment to preventing Iran from ever obtaining nuclear weapons. The official cautioned that no final agreements were reached, but said the two sides made progress on the issues on the table. 5 months of war. To understand what Iran meant as an agenda item on Tuesday requires understanding just how much has happened since February 28, when the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign, code-named Operation Epic Fury by the Pentagon, against Iran. The stated aims, according to both governments, were to dismantle Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs and to pressure the Iranian regime toward collapse. The opening strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, in a decapitation strike that instantly reshaped the conflict. Iran has since named his son as successor. Iran's retaliation was immediate and expansive. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones were launched against Israel, American military installations across the Middle East, and Gulf Arab states, alongside strikes on oil infrastructure. Iran also moved to choke off the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes, warning ships away, and, over time, firing on vessels that failed to comply. According to World Trade Organization data cited by British parliamentary researchers, the volume of crude oil shipping through the strait fell by roughly 95% after the war began, and LNG shipments fell by nearly 99%, sending global energy prices sharply higher and disrupting supply chains as far away as India, which has tried to remain neutral in the conflict despite facing its own domestic energy strain. A conditional ceasefire was declared on April 8, and by early May the most intense phase of direct US-Israeli strikes on Iran had wound down. But the underlying dispute over the strait never fully resolved. In June, the two sides reached a memorandum of understanding intended to reopen Hormuz and formally end the war, an agreement Netanyahu's government vehemently opposed, arguing it handed Tehran leverage while extracting few real concessions. That Mao effectively collapsed after Iran, in early July, began firing on commercial vessels that it said were violating its designated shipping routes, hitting at least 3 ships on July the 6th and 7th alone. The US responded with renewed strikes, triggering 13 consecutive days of escalation before the fighting paused again just days before Tuesday's meetings. By Tuesday, the Pentagon's own accounting of the human cost of the war had shifted. The department's public death toll for American losses was revised downward from 18 to 14 the previous Thursday, a change that drew scrutiny from independent observers. Meanwhile, U.S. Central Command said more than 20 American warships were now operating across the Middle East, enforcing what officials describe as a steel wall blockade against Iran. CENTCOM reported that, as of Tuesday, it had redirected 18 commercial vessels attempting to reach Iranian ports, disabled 2, and boarded 2 more to verify compliance. Hours before the Oval Office meeting, Trump discussed the conflict in a Fox News interview, telling viewers that Iran was allegedly expanding a nuclear-linked facility referred to as Pickaxe Mountain, and that the U.S. could destroy it very easily, citing advanced U.S. Space Force surveillance capability trained on the site. That remark set an unmistakably hawkish tone heading into the Oval Office sit-down, even as both sides publicly emphasized diplomacy and progress on resolving the Hormuz standoff. Separately on Tuesday, Middle Eastern diplomats told reporters there had been movement in efforts to resolve the Strait crisis, though no agreement had yet been finalized. Beyond Iran, Gaza, Lebanon and the Abraham Accords. Iran dominated the conversation, but it was far from the only item on the agenda. A White House official told reporters ahead of the meeting that the two leaders were also expected to discuss a framework agreement the United States and Israel signed with Lebanon addressing the aftermath of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict, as well as efforts to expand the Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab states first brokered during Trump's first term. Trump has recently pressed Saudi Arabia to formally normalize relations with Israel, a diplomatic prize that has eluded American negotiators for years, and that would represent one of the most significant realignments in the modern Middle East. Gaza also loomed over the visit, even if it received less public emphasis than Iran. The war there has moved through several distinct phases since the October 2023 Hamas attack that triggered it. A ceasefire framework, endorsed by a United Nations Security Council resolution in November 2025 and built around what the Trump administration calls its comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict, secured the release of all hostages, and established an American-chaired transitional body known as the Board of Peace to oversee governance in the territory, alongside an international stabilization force meant to monitor the truce and oversee Hamas's disarmament. But independent trackers monitoring the deal's implementation describe a stalled and uneven process 9 months on. Israel has continued to expand its military footprint inside Gaza well beyond the boundaries originally envisioned, controlling an estimated 70% of the territory as of this summer, while roughly 2.1 million Palestinians remain displaced and compressed into shrinking areas of the Strip. Humanitarian organizations continue to describe conditions in Gaza as a severe and ongoing crisis, even as the acute hostage crisis that dominated headlines for 2 years has formally ended. A relationship under strain.